All right, today we're pulling back the curtain on global trade. We're going to look at the hidden machinery that makes it all work. We'll trace the fascinating story of how the world went from these chaotic, all-out trade wars to a system with actual rules designed to stop them from happening. So let's dive in. And it all really boils down to this one big question. If every country is trying to look out for number one, why would they ever agree to tie their own hands with these super complicated international deals like the World Trade Organization? I mean, it seems counterintuitive, right? Well, that question is the absolute core of commercial policy, and we're going to unpack it together. So, here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the strategic puzzle at the heart of it all, the trade dilemma. Then, we'll see what happens when that dilemma goes horribly wrong in the real world with the story of the Great Tariff Wall. After that, we'll look at the brilliant idea that started to fix things, how that grew into the global system we know, and finally, we'll land right here in the present day with the WTO and all the controversies surrounding it. Okay, let's get right to the heart of the matter. The biggest challenge in international trade can be explained perfectly by something from game theory called the prisoner's dilemma. It might sound a bit academic, but trust me, it's simple and it's the key to everything. It's basically a classic trap where everyone acts in their own best interest, and because of that, they all end up worse off than if they'd just worked together. Here's how the trap is set. We know that in a perfect world, free trade is a win-win for everyone. But, and this is a huge but, there's a powerful temptation. Any single country can get a temporary leg up by slapping tariffs on imports, while everyone else is still playing nice. This move improves their terms of trade, which just means they get more for their exports and pay less for their imports. And that temptation to cheat is what makes everything so difficult. This chart right here lays it all out perfectly. Let's look at this from the US perspective for a sec. First, let's say China puts up tariffs. The US can either do the same and get a score of 80, or keep trading freely and get stuck with 30. Easy choice, right? You go for 80. Now, what if China chooses free trade? Well, the US could impose tariffs and get a huge score of 100, or stick to free trade and get 50. Again, it's a no-brainer. You go for 100. So you see, no matter what China does, the US always has an incentive to impose tariffs. And the exact same logic works for China. And that's the trap. Both countries logically choose tariffs, and they end up in that top left box, a trade war where they both get 80, which is way worse for both of them than the 50 they could have had if they just cooperated. And listen, this isn't just some theory in a textbook. This exact dilemma played out on the global stage, and the results were absolutely catastrophic. Let's turn to the history books, to the cautionary tale of the 1930s, which shows us exactly what happens when this prisoner's dilemma spirals out of control. So to really get this crisis, you have to know a little bit of history. Early on, U.S. tariffs were mainly just a way for the government to make money. The first tariff law back in 1789, it was just about paying the bills for a new country. But over the decades, as the government found other ways to get revenue, like the income tax, the reason for tariffs changed. It became less about money and more about protectionism, shielding American industries from competition. And this all came to a head in 1930 with the infamous Smoot-Hawley Act. And the scale of this was just wow. Smoot-Hawley jacked up the average U.S. tariff on protected goods to a mind-boggling 53%. Think about that. That's not a tax. That's a wall. The goal seems simple enough. Try to fight the Great Depression by forcing people to buy American. But, as you can imagine, the rest of the world saw things a little differently. The backlash was immediate, and it was devastating. The U.S. ignored protests from other countries, so they started to hit back hard. 25 countries retaliated. Spain targeted American oranges. Canada tripled its tariffs. Italy went after U.S. cars. It was a classic tit-for-tat trade war, and the result was the total meltdown of the international trading system, which only made the Great Depression deeper and longer for absolutely everyone. But out of the ashes of that economic disaster, a truly new idea was born. The world had learned a very painful lesson. Going it alone with protectionism is a dead end. To get out of the prisoner's dilemma, they had to figure out a way to trust each other. Let's look at the first big idea that made this possible. In 1934, the U.S. passed something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, the RTAA, and honestly, it was a stroke of genius. First, it took the power to set tariffs away from Congress and gave it to the president. This made negotiations way faster and less political. But the second part was the real game changer. It established reciprocity. The idea was simple. We'll lower our tariffs on your stuff, but only if you lower your tariffs on our stuff. It was a way to de-escalate together. Now, the third piece of the puzzle was the one that made the whole system go global. It's called the Most Favored Nation Clause, or MFN, and it's such a brilliant rule. It says if the U.S. makes a deal with, say, Germany for a lower tariff on cars, it automatically has to give that same low tariff to every other country it trades with. No special deals, no favorites. It ensures that when one barrier comes down, the benefit spreads to everybody. And the RTAA started to work. By 1945, the U.S. had over 30 of these one-on-one deals. But that was still a messy patchwork. The next big idea was, hey, instead of all these separate deals, what if we made one big agreement for everyone? And that thinking led directly to the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, better known as the GATT. So the GATT was born in 1947, and it was basically the hard-won wisdom from the 1930s written down as a rulebook. Its core ideas were designed to be a permanent fix for the prisoner's dilemma. Non-discrimination was key. That's the MFN rule. Reciprocity was the engine that would lower the barriers. Transparency meant no more secret rules. And really importantly, it pushed for tariffs instead of quotas, because tariffs are just more straightforward and less disruptive to markets. And that no favorites idea had another crucial part to it, the national treatment principle. This rule is all about what happens after a product has crossed the border and paid its tariff. It says you have to treat that imported product exactly the same as a homegrown one. You can't let it in the door and then hit it with some sneaky special tax or a regulation that only applies to foreign goods. It's about ensuring a level playing field. Honestly, you can boil that whole most favored nation principle down to this one simple, incredibly powerful phrase. Favor one, favor all. That's it. That's the bedrock of the whole multilateral system. It's the simple commitment that stops the world from splintering into a bunch of rival clubs and ensures everyone gets to play by the same rules. Now, for decades, the GATT did an amazing job lowering tariffs. But by the 1990s, the world had gotten way more complicated. Trade wasn't just about goods anymore. It was about services and ideas and intellectual property. The system needed an upgrade. So in 1995, the GATT was transformed into a new, more powerful body, the World Trade Organization. So what really changed with the WTO? Well, a few big things. GATT was really just an agreement, while the WTO is a permanent, actual organization. Its scope is way bigger, covering services and intellectual property. But the single most important change was dispute settlement. GATT's system for handling arguments was pretty weak. It was easy to block a ruling. The WTO created a much stronger system with real teeth to enforce the rules. Now, giving an international body teeth gets some people pretty worried. It leads to the most common criticism of the WTO, that it destroys national sovereignty. But it's really important to get this right. The WTO is not a world government. It can't force a country to change its laws. If you lose a case, you have options. Change your law, offer some other trade benefit as compensation, or just do nothing. But if you do nothing, the country that won the case is authorized to retaliate. So you see, you keep your sovereignty, but your choices have consequences. Another huge point of debate is the environment. Critics argue that the WTO is so focused on free trade that it encourages countries to exploit their natural resources unsustainably. They worry it creates a race to the bottom where nations weaken their own environmental laws to stay competitive, and that when push comes to shove, the trade rules always win out over protecting the planet. But of course, there's a strong counter-argument. Supporters will point out that the trade rules themselves, way back in the original GATT, actually allow for exceptions to protect animal and plant life. They also argue that trade makes countries richer, and richer countries have more resources to invest in green technology. Plus, the WTO actively works to make it cheaper to trade things like solar panels and wind turbines, helping that green transition along. And that brings us right to our doorstep, to today. We've seen this incredible journey from the chaos of the prisoner's dilemma to this complex global institution. But that fundamental tension, that temptation to go it alone, it never really goes away. This whole system was built as an answer to the destructive nationalism of the 1930s. It was founded on cooperation. And that leaves us with the critical question for our own time. In this new era of rising nationalism, can a system built on working together actually survive? Something for us all to think about. Thanks for joining me.